The unpopularity of President Trump in suburban parts of Virginia has created a significant problem for Republicans down ballot.
On this episode of Transition Virginia, we take a look at races where Democrats are hoping to turn red districts blue. We're joined by Cameron Webb.
Instead of corporate welfare, I'd like to focus on the welfare of individuals.
And Qasim Rashid.
Advocacy alone isn't enough. There are broken systems that need reform.
With analysis from Stephen Farnsworth.
The unpopularity of President Trump in suburban parts of Virginia has created a significant problem for Republicans down ballot.
All that and so much more on this episode of Transition Virginia. Welcome to Transition Virginia, the podcast that examines the transition of power from Republican to Democrat. My name is Michael Pope.
And I'm Thomas Bowman. Today on the podcast, we're going to take a look at the congressional races on the ballot in Virginia. Will Republicans be able to keep their 4 House seats, or will Democrats be able to turn any of those red seats blue? Later in the podcast, we'll talk to 2 Democrats running in seats currently held by Republicans.
But first, we're going to take a look at what's on the ballot this year and what we can expect to happen on Election Day. To help walk us through the candidates, we're joined by a friend of the podcast who appeared on one of our last in-person episodes, way before the pandemic happened. He's director of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies at the University of Mary Washington, and he's the author of several books, including his latest, Late Night with Trump, Political Humor and the American Presidency. Stephen Farnsworth, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be back.
Dr. Farnsworth, let's just get the presidential election out of the way. Most observers now believe Biden will carry Virginia, and presuming he wins, what kind of margin do you think we can expect to see from his campaign in Virginia?
The polls show an advantage to Biden of about 11 points in some polls and closer to 5 in others. I'd be inclined to say probably split the difference. 8 or 9 point margin is the most likely outcome.
Now, I want to ask you about the race for Senate. This is at the top of the ticket, and it's not a race that's really attracted a lot of attention. It's not on anybody's list of races to watch. But then again, this also wasn't a race on anyone's list back in 2014, when Mark Warner came really close to losing against Republican Ed Gillespie. Now he's facing Republican Daniel Gade, who's been criticizing Warner for casting what he calls the deciding vote on the Affordable Care Act. Now, during a recent debate on NBC, Warner attacked Gade for wanting to get rid of protections for people with pre-existing conditions. That prompted this exchange. Now, first you'll hear Daniel Gade, followed by Mark Warner's response.
Yeah, there were 25 states when the ACA was passed that had already protected people with pre-existing conditions. And the idea that I would take away protections for people with pre-existing conditions is offensive, and it's false, and it's defamatory. Look, you can't see my body because I'm behind this podium, but I have a pre-existing condition myself because I got my leg blown off in Iraq. And since then, I've worked with people with disabilities. I've been on the National Council on Disability. There's nobody who cares more about people with pre-existing conditions in this country than I do. And the fact that he's putting out these ridiculous mailers, listen, 2014 called Market, wants its campaign back. That's not who I am. It's a lie.
You can't have it both ways. If my opponent wants to change his position and say he supported my decision along with John McCain to keep the ACA, he can make that change. But you can't go out and criticize me for the ACA and then cherry pick which parts of the ACA you want to preserve. It just doesn't work that way.
Stephen Farnsworth, is it possible for Daniel Gade to be against the ACA and also for protecting pre-existing conditions?
Of course, everything is possible in politics, including inconsistencies. The reality is that if the Affordable Care Act is defeated in the courts, there will not be pre-existing condition protections for people under the Affordable Care Act law. The challenge that the Republicans have had to face in Washington has been to offer up a viable alternative to the Affordable Care Act. The repeal and replace movement was really more about repeal than ever about any specific replacement mechanism. It's smart politics not to offer an alternative vision of a bill that would cover some people and not cover others, or have limitations in the coverage. And so you can understand why the Republicans don't want to offer a specific replacement system. But make no mistake about it, no system is the replacement right now if the Affordable Care Act is defeated. And so it's very tough for any Republican who wants to win over conservatives opposed to the Affordable Care Act to do well in a statewide election in a swing state where, like in Virginia, a majority of people strongly support the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare, in fact, is more popular now than it ever was when Obama was president.
Let's go back to 2018 when Democrats were able to flip 3 red districts. You have Abigail Spanberger beating Dave Bratt, you have Elaine Loria beating Scott Taylor, and of course you also have Jennifer Wexton beating Barbara Comstock. We'll come back to the 10th district in a moment. For now, let's talk about CD7 and CD2. Are these races that the Democrats won in 2018 really all that contested for 2020?
Well, they absolutely are. These districts were both designed to elect Republicans, but over the years, the districts have changed a little bit since the 2010 census, and particularly the unpopularity of President Trump in suburban parts of Virginia has created a significant problem for Republicans down ballot. We saw it, of course, in 2018 with these congressional elections. We've also seen it in the 2017 and 2019 legislative elections in Virginia. But both of these districts have a significant number of suburban voters, and those voters are exactly the kind of Republicans who are having their doubts about President Trump. They really don't care for the combative approach, and they also tell pollsters that the focus on a Christian conservative social agenda is less connecting to them than the more traditional small tax, small government rules that offered up a more moderate vision of republicanism before Trump. I think Trump has created a liability, a challenge for the candidates who are under the Republican label, particularly in a state like Virginia. And these 2 congressional districts demonstrate the challenges that Republicans have to face. The districts were drawn to elect Republicans, but Republicans have found it difficult to keep them in the age of Trump. Perhaps in 2020, the Republicans will have a better outcome.
I want to ask you about the most interesting congressional race on the ballot this year, and that's the 5th congressional district. This is the sprawling district that runs all the way from Southside Virginia all the way up to Northern Virginia. This is where incumbent Congressman Denver Riggleman was defeated in a drive-by convention by Republican Bob Good. He's facing Democrat Cameron Webb, who we'll hear from later on in this episode, so stay tuned for that. Dr. Farnsworth, I'm curious, what does it say about this district that Riggleman lost to Good in this drive-by convention? And do you think that Webb has a chance of turning this district from red to blue?
Well, certainly of the 3 districts that we're talking about right now, this would be the biggest challenge for a Democratic candidate. This was a district that was drawn to elect a Republican like other districts in Virginia. And this district, which stretches from the outer suburbs of Northern Virginia all the way down to Danville in the North Carolina line, going through Charlottesville, Lynchburg, and elsewhere, this is a district that is going to have a significantly larger Christian conservative population. This is an area where Trump-style Republicanism is going to be more effective in terms of reaching voters than in either the 2nd district or the 7th district that we were talking about a moment ago. In this district, though, the incumbent Republican congressman, Denver Riggleman, would have been, I think, a more compelling candidate for the Republicans to put forward in the general election. But he did not win a lot of support among Christian conservatives when he officiated at a same-sex wedding during his time in the public eye. That created, I think, an opportunity for a socially conservative Republican to win the nomination in the 5th district. But it's important to recognize that the reason that Riggleman lost has as much to do with the choices that the Republican Party makes about the nomination process itself. If this had been a primary, a conventional primary, Republicans would have, I suspect, supported the incumbent, who would have been a stronger general election candidate. But the convention process, particularly during the days of COVID, is going to have an extraordinarily small number of people participating. And of course, as the day went on, there were fewer and fewer people sticking around. I don't know if either of you were there that day, but it was an extraordinarily hot and ugly day, even by summer standards in Virginia. And so only the true believers went there in the first place, and only the truest of those true believers stuck around until the final decision was made. The Republicans, I think, have taken a district that would have been an easy Republican win and have created a more competitive district. Right now, the Cook Political Report has all three of these districts as toss-ups, but of the three, I do think that the 5th district is the one that Democrats are least likely to win.
We're going to hear from Qasim Rashid later on in the podcast, but let's talk about the 1st district real quick. Rashid's campaign strategy effectively boils down to there might be enough new voters in Stafford, plus anger at the Republicans to push Rashid over the edge. I would imagine he also needs some kind of significant margin of victory from a Biden win to make that seat competitive. What do you think it would take for Rashid to win, Dr. Farnsworth?
Well, my initial reaction, if it doesn't sound too sarcastic, is he would need different lines in this district. The boundaries of the district are particularly Republican-friendly, more so than any of the districts we've talked about so far. This is a district that includes significantly large elements of religious conservatives in the area stretching south of Fredericksburg, down the Northern Neck and the Middle Peninsula. This is a district that goes from Prince William County pretty much all the way down to Hampton Roads. And that is a district that has a lot of rural voters, a lot of conservative voters, and a lot of voters that have voted for Rob Whitman repeatedly in the past. Remember, he's a pretty experienced Republican, one of the more senior Republicans out of the delegation in Congress right now. And that creates an environment where it's an uphill struggle for a Democrat. Whitman also, I think, over his career has been careful not to be too conservative. So that he has more appeal to suburban voters than some of the other Republicans that we've been talking about, like say David Brat in particular, and that creates an environment. I think Rashid is an effective campaigner. He was part of a debate that we hosted at Mary Washington a few weeks ago. He was able to also compete in a state Senate election in Stafford County previously a year ago. And so he has some experience, but ultimately his prospects, I think, in politics are going to be brighter after a new census and perhaps some different line drawing. Maybe he'll end up in the Senate or in the state Senate, or maybe he'll end up in Congress in a future election. But the challenges here are pretty immense. And one of the key things to appreciate when you look at these elections is to get a sense of how important the donations are. You have to be able to compete effectively with a significant amount of money. And this race, the 1st district race, is simply not on the list of a targeted race by the Democrats. It's not on the list of getting top campaign contributions on the Republican side either. And until you see this district being identified by potential donors as one where their money is a good investment, you're going to see a challenge to replace an incumbent.
On the topic of red to blue, I'm curious about a seat that was Republican not all that long ago. In fact, it was the same wave election where Spanberger beat Brad and Luria beat Taylor. There was another election where Democrats were able to turn a red district blue, the 10th congressional district up in Northern Virginia. That's where Jennifer Wexton was able to unseat incumbent Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock. Now, unlike the 2nd and the 7th, though, this was not a Trump district. Hillary Clinton won this district, which is why Comstock was trying to position herself as a non-Trump Republican. That did not work out so well for her. Now, this is not an election that's on anybody's list of races to watch. Dr. Farnsworth, why not?
It really has to do with whether it's a good investment of time and money. And the 10th district, very large element of suburban voting in that district. It includes parts of Prince William. It includes Loudoun County. It includes a lot of areas where Republicans used to do well, but not so well during the age of Trump. I think even if you go back to the 2016 Republican primary in Virginia, there was a much more effective environment in the suburbs for the Marco Rubio campaign than the Trump campaign. President Trump is at his strongest when he's talking to rural voters, not suburban voters. And particularly when you're talking about the suburban voters who live in the district that Wexton now represents, that's a district with a lot of government workers too. And so the anti-government messaging of Trump and the attacks on a more diverse America, Make America Great Again, I think has a reference to a less diverse America as part of the dynamic there. You can see that this is a difficult environment for Republicans in the age of Trump. I think if Trump were not president right now, this district could potentially be more competitive. But if you look at public opinion over the last several years, one thing stands out above all else. There is almost nobody in the middle anymore in Virginia politics. People vote Republican more or less up and down the ballot, or they vote Democratic more or less up and down the ballot. There's very little in the way of swing voters. I mean, it really is a huge change. If you think back to, say, the 2001 gubernatorial election, when Mark Warner won, he did very well in areas where in the 2014 election, 13 years later, he did not do nearly as well. If you think about Southwest and Southside Virginia and you compare Mark Warner in 2001 to Mark Warner in 2014, there's almost no crossover voting in those areas. And that goes on both sides. The areas where Republicans in the suburbs used to do better, the Republicans, whether it's President Trump or a Republican running for Congress, they really struggle in those suburban districts. And so I think what's going on now is a kind of a big sort in American politics. And that is creating an environment where your party label has as much or more to do with your outcome than what you say as a candidate. If you have an R after your name and you're running in Loudoun County, good luck.
All right, we're going to take a break now, and we're going to hear from Cameron Webb. That's the Democrat trying to turn a red district blue in central Virginia. Then we're going to hear from Qasim Rashid. He's the Democrat running against incumbent Republican Rob Whitman. Later in the show, Stephen Farnsworth will be returning for Question Time. Hey, you. Yes, you. You're listening to Transition Virginia right now, and you're probably a fan of the podcast, right? Well, then rate and review, like Trevor Sutherland.
1 star. The only time I listen is when I'm on.
That's not really what I was thinking. Well, how about this review from Richard Krause?
This piece of shit podcast, I wouldn't even rate 1 star.
Come on, listeners. I know you can do better than that. Hit the pause button right now and give us a quick review. Welcome back to Transition Virginia. It's time to head over to the 5th Congressional District, which is one of the hottest congressional races on the ballot this year in Virginia. And we're now joined by the Democrat in that race, Dr. Cameron Webb. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Webb.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Great to be with you all today.
Well, I want to start by asking you the most important question for any candidate, and I'm going to ask it in a way that I'm stealing this from a good friend of mine, the publisher of Connection newspapers. This is the question she always asks candidates. Dr. Webb, why are you doing this to yourself?
Well, I'm doing it to myself because I'm passionate about serving my community. That's always been the thing that animates me, and that's what led me into a career in medicine. Yes, I'm a physician, but I consider myself a healer in so many ways. That's the work that I aim to do, and that's also what took me into doing social justice work and really helping out our communities in different ways. And for me, it was just seeing that the reality is that health doesn't happen in hospitals and clinics, but it happens in our communities, the places where we're born, grow, live, learn, eat, play, and pray. And because of that, I always go upstream of folks coming in with medical conditions, and I say, what are the social conditions that drive that? So I've been in the policy space thinking about those issues for years and just recognizing things are just getting worse with every year that passes for a lot of parts of our community, a lot of the patients I serve. And then finally, with the imminent threat to the Affordable Care Act and the reality that we have to be ready to build a healthcare system that truly works for everybody. And I want to be on that line, helping to do that work.
Let's talk about healthcare real quick. How has the coronavirus impacted your district, and do you think your opponent would do enough to stop it?
Well, the coronavirus has had a big impact on not just the United States. With at this point, I think we're hitting 200,000 deaths sometime in the next day or two. We've had over 3,000 deaths here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And in my direct area, I'm in Albemarle County, we're still seeing a lot of cases, and it's definitely brought things to a halt. Yes, there are health implications of COVID, but there are huge economic implications of COVID as well. And we've lost a lot of our small businesses that are so important to our community. In terms of my opponent, to be quite honest, I haven't heard much in terms of thoughtful plans on how he would address the coronavirus pandemic. I've heard him say that we need to safely reopen, and I tell him to spend a little bit more time on that word safely. That means there's quite a bit that you can pack into those 6 letters. And I think that from my standpoint, that means we're testing adequately. That means we're leaning into making sure that folks have the resources they need to make the good decision to stay home rather than go to work. And that may be paid sick leave. Again, I have a deep expertise on this. I actually work in the coronavirus unit. And so, I see this up close and personal, and we have a huge task in front of us. The vaccine is going to be coming at some point in the next few months, and we have to restore the public confidence that this is something that'll work for us. And so I think that when it comes to COVID, both on the economic front and on the health front, I'm better equipped to deal with it than my opponent, just based on my deep expertise in this virus and how it's impacting our communities.
Speaking of your opponent, Dr. Webb, he's thrown a lot of attacks at you. One of them is about the economy. You and he were on a virtual panel discussion recently, and he said this.
I want to help renew and expand the Trump economy. I don't want to reverse and go backwards to an Obama-Biden economy, but I want to continue to support the free market capitalism versus what my opponent and his allies would do with more socialist policies. We need to preserve and expand the Trump tax cuts. Biden has already announced that he and my opponent would raise taxes by $4 trillion on 82% of Americans would experience a tax increase if Biden were elected.
Dr. Webb, do you want socialist policies? Do you want to raise taxes?
I have no desire for socialist policies that would raise taxes. I think that even hearing that quote again, I remember how bewildering it was the first time I heard it. My opponent throws a lot of scary sounding things out. I think he just tries to confuse and conflate. But the fact of the matter is that very tax bill that he's talking about from 2017, that added $1.9 trillion to our federal deficit. So he's not exactly the poster child for austerity. I think that what we're talking about is making sure that any kind of tax benefits, they accrue to the middle class, to working class individuals. And that's certainly not what that 2017 bill did. And so, sure, I'd like to reverse that tax cut. Instead of corporate welfare, I'd like to focus on the welfare of individuals in our working class. And so, yeah, I have some differences of opinion on that particular tax bill and how it can serve Americans well. But when it comes to the policies that we have, look, I'm focused on what I call free market fairness, leaning into the true benefit of both what we can do through the market and what we can do by ensuring that the floor for what Americans experience is a little bit higher. And I think that plays out in a lot of spaces. That's what drives my policy on the environment, on climate change. Clean and renewable energy sources are cheaper than fossil fuels. So let's stop propping up the fossil fuel technologies because of corporate special interests. That's not looking to do anything extreme. That's looking to follow what the market's telling us to do. And I want to remind my opponent exactly what that Obama economy looked like. It was growing at about 2.3% year over year. The Trump economy is at 2.5%. And so we've continued to see that increase in trajectory. That Trump economy, remember, this COVID pandemic has upset that entire economy. This is a different time. This is a different moment than it was pre-March 2020. And so for my opponent to just say, I want to wind back the clock and go back in time, sir, we're in a different moment. And you've got to be ready for the moment that we're in, not the moment you want us to be in.
One policy area that you might end up doing a lot of time talking about if you're elected to Congress is healthcare. The Supreme Court is about to take up this challenge to Obamacare, and it's very possible that the Affordable Care Act could go away, which means that the next Congress, and if you're successful, you as a member of Congress, might have to do some serious policy discussions about the healthcare system. Now, on the campaign trail, you've talked about Medicare for all. You're not for Medicare for all, but you are for the public option. Explain that exactly, sort of where you are on the healthcare policy and what you see Congress doing if the Supreme Court overturns the Affordable Care Act.
I always tell people, there are competing values that folks have in the American healthcare system. For some, it's that everyone has access to care. For some, it's this notion of choice. And I think that one of the ways that we preserve that notion of choice is we preserve private insurance. For a lot of individuals, over 50% of Americans get their coverage through their employer. Now, for me, I think we should move away from employer-sponsored insurance, and instead, employers can make defined contributions to their employees so that they can decide whether to buy the public insurance option or a private insurance option. What that does is it maintains the role that private insurance plays in innovating, but also offering diverse products to the American people. And I talk about innovation with private insurance because as a health provider, I've seen firsthand how private insurance has driven our movement to value-based payment models as opposed to just fee-for-service. They've been on the leading edge of moving toward value-based payment, and Medicare is catching up some, and that's great. But again, you don't want to say, hey, there's nothing good about private insurance. We want to give that space a chance to innovate, to adapt. And that's something I learned in the White House is there's still a lot of space for that innovation and adaptation. My opponent says he wants to preserve the protections for pre-existing conditions. I don't think he fully understands all that requires in terms of working with insurance companies, of the value of an individual mandate, of everybody being covered so that you can offset the cost of individuals with pre-existing conditions.
Actually, I was interested in following up on the Supreme Court issue. After the death of Justice Ginsburg, there has been a lot of talk among Democrats about adding seats to the Supreme Court. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution that says it needs to be 9 seats, and it actually has been different numbers. If you go back into the distant past, you'll see the Supreme Court sometimes was larger, sometimes was smaller. Dr. Webb, what's your position on potentially adding new justices to the Supreme Court?
I'm not a fan of court packing. I know FDR proposed that doctrine to help move things forward with the New Deal when the court kind of had some opposition. I think that it's one of those decisions that ultimately can do more harm than good, but I'm not a fan of court packing.
One more question before we go. So this is a pretty solidly Republican district. Ken Cuccinelli won this back in 2013 with 52% of the vote. Donald Trump won this in 2016 with 55% of the vote. Ed Gillespie won this in 2017 with 54% of the vote. Even Corey Stewart won this district. What makes you think you can turn this red district blue?
Well, because I disagree that this is a solid Republican district. I think it's a conservative-leaning district. And I think what's happened is by ignoring the fact that a large number of the conservatives in our district are moderate, are libertarian, by ignoring what their values are and their views are, they're looking for somebody who can represent them a little more appropriately. And then furthermore, we've had a lack of voter participation in certain segments of the district. I always remind folks, this district is nearly 20% African American. There are 9 counties in the southern portion of the district with more than 35% African American population. And certainly not suggesting that every black voter in this district is going to vote Democrat, but I think that this is rooted in kind of a historic dynamic of voter suppression. And I think a big part of what we saw in 2008 when Tom Perriello won, albeit by 727 votes, was large African American voter turnout. And that kind of energy that we saw in 2008, we're seeing it again now.
All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back on Transition Virginia, we're going to hear from Qasim Rashid. He's the Democrat running against incumbent Congressman Rob Whitman, hoping to turn the 1st congressional district from red to blue.
Michael, do you ever wish you could go back and check the transcripts of our episode?
A transcript? Do you mean like the Nixon tapes?
Yeah. Now you can find the smoking gun of Virginia politics at transitionvirginia.com. Just click the link for notes and you'll see audio and now transcripts.
You can search for keywords like dirty trick or onion ring.
We're building our blog to feature even more great content over the coming months.
You can find it all at transitionvirginia.com.
And we're back on Transition Virginia. Qasim Rashid, the Democrat for the 1st Congressional District, is in the House today. Qasim, how are you?
I'm great, Michael. It's great to be with you guys today.
Excellent. Well, we are glad to have you. So let's go and talk about your congressional race. Qasim, why are you running?
My whole life has been focused on this element of service to humanity. It's what our parents ingrained in us from the very get-go. We're immigrants to this country. We left a country that persecutes us for our faith to pursue that equal justice promise in our Constitution. And along with that promise, our parents really ingrained in us as teachers, they're both teachers, that your job here is to serve humanity. And if you're failing at that, you're failing at life. And so that kind of was ingrained in us from the get-go. And even though we struggled, when my brother enlisted in the U.S. Marines, we were a military family. And like 1 in 5 military families in Virginia today, we were on food stamps. I've been working since I was 15 years old to make sure we could make ends meet. But that's just what we had to do. Now, out of that struggle, a lot of good has come. All 3 of my siblings are successful in the business world. I'm a human rights lawyer. It's my wife, Aisha, that convinced me to go to law school in the first place. And at Richmond Law is where I really got hooked. I started working pro bono at the Virginia Poverty Law Center, the Office of Domestic and Sexual Violence. I've worked with nonprofits across the country, around the world, to expand healthcare and education access. Worked in criminal justice reform as a prison chaplain for about 4 years. And the 2 things I've learned from that, one is that these issues that plague our society, mental illness and addiction and homelessness and domestic violence, these don't have a political party. They impact all of us. And the second thing that I learned is that advocacy alone isn't enough. There are broken systems, unjust systems that need reform. And so that's where I'm running for Congress, to take my years of advocacy working across the political spectrum in a bipartisan manner to serve humanity, the same mission my parents ingrained in me from the get-go.
So let me ask you about your district here. You're running against Rob Whitman, who is a Republican incumbent. He's been reelected many times. Trump won this particular district pretty handily with more than 10% of margin of victory. So this is a Trump district. This is a red district. What makes you think that you can beat a Republican incumbent in this district?
Well, we look at the history and we look at how people's views are shifting. This is a district that, yes, has historically been a red district, but I think people are beginning to recognize that the partisanship, vitriol is not working. And that's why this district has consistently moved more to the center and to the left over the years. For example, as recently as 2018, when Tim Kaine ran for re-election, he lost this district by only 1.4 points. The margin of victory for the Republican in this district was only 4,000 votes. And this year, when we're expecting, hundreds of thousands of votes being cast, 4,000 votes is really within the margin of error.
Qasim, so not very many people actually know Rob Whitman. He keeps a pretty low profile. And one thing that I always counsel candidates trying to take out an incumbent is that you need to show to the district why they should fire their incumbent representative. So who is Rob Whitman, and why should the constituents of CD1 fire him?
Well, I think we have to remember that you can like somebody as an individual and dislike their policies and dislike the way they've served. I've spoken with him, and he's a personable guy. I absolutely love the way he talks about his wife. He clearly is still gaga over her, and that's a decent man right there. But I think that what we need is somebody who is going to work across the aisle, someone who will lead with compassion, someone who will put the needs of working families first, not the needs of the corporations. And for that, you have to look at his voting record. And his voting record shows a person who is hyper-partisan, a person who does not really care about working families, does not care about our military, does not care about law enforcement, does not care about first responders, and certainly does not care about those who may not vote for him. And I'll give you a couple of really good examples of that. Despite this pandemic, he has voted over 40 times to repeal the ACA without a replacement. He supports the president's lawsuit to kick off anyone who has a pre-existing condition from healthcare. The Bipartisan Heroes Act, which would have extended unemployment benefits during this critical time, he voted against it. That also provided $900 billion in funding to ensure our local and state governments and police departments could make payroll. He voted to defund the police.
On the issue of things that Congressman Whitman is against, he was on WMAL recently talking about the suggestion from this work group to rename, remove, or recontextualize many of the monuments and memorials in Washington, D.C. I want to play a clip from that WMAL appearance and get your reaction to it.
This is really a far-left, radical, completely disconnected from reality, a stunt. That's all I can think of it to be. Or it's at worst an attempt to completely do away with our nation's history and really erase the names of our nation's founders. I mean, it's just unfathomable to me. And you pointed out Washington Monument, Jefferson Memorial, George Mason Memorial, again, all great Virginians, Zachary Taylor, William Henry Harrison, Woodrow Wilson. I mean, you go down the line and you think, why would you want to do that?
Qasim Rashid, why would you want to do that?
You know, I'm really flabbergasted at how offended he is to have accurate history recorded. Someone who is offended by contextualizing history because it dishonors, apparently, the great men and women of our history would surely be furious that a foreign hostile nation put bounties on our service members, paid the terrorist organization known as the Taliban to kill them, and the president did nothing. Surely someone offended by contextualizing monuments would be offended that the president referred to traumatic brain injury as headaches and mocked those service members who suffered traumatic brain injury. Surely someone offended by contextualizing monuments would be upset that the president called our Marines killed in actions suckers and losers. But unfortunately, my opponent hasn't had a single thing to say about all of those horrible atrocities. The fact that he has been silent on every single grotesque violation by this president against our own military tells me all I need to know about who he serves. It's not our military, it's not our service members, it's the one occupant in the White House who got 5 deferments because he didn't have the courage or the integrity to serve his nation when his nation needed him.
I want to ask you what Congressman Rashid would be up to if you win the election, you head to Congress, you're representing the 1st congressional district, and you want to do something about broadband. I feel like this is one of those issues where people talk about it over and over again, and I feel like not a lot seems to be happening. Give us some specifics here. What would Congressman Rashid do to expand broadband in the 1st congressional district and across Virginia?
We would make it a utility. Look, when you say people talk about it, I think you mean my opponent. We disagree on a lot, but the one thing that he and I have in common is that in the 13 years he's been in Congress, we've both passed the same number of bills on broadband. 0. And that should be a problem, that you've been in Congress 13 years and you can't pass one single bill on broadband and you claim that it is a staple of your public service. We have seen the data, we have done the research, and the only logical conclusion is that broadband internet needs to be a utility the same way electricity, the phone lines, the water, sewage are utility. Look, water wasn't a utility until our coal miners in rural parts of our country said, we are literally dying, we need water. And no private company was willing to build it out because it didn't make them any profit, and therefore water became a utility. The Rural Electrification Act of 1936 did the same thing. No private entity was willing to build it out because it didn't make them money, and so therefore the government stepped in, and that's how we built up rural America. The same thing must happen now with broadband internet. We cannot rely on corporations. Look, according to one study, since 1990, we have invested, I would rather say sunk, $400 billion into corporations to build out broadband internet type of technology. $400 billion. And in the meantime, our rural communities are suffering and struggling, and our lower income and Black and Hispanic communities are struggling because of this phenomenon known as digital redlining, where they are not building broadband internet in these lower income and in these Black and brown communities. So our solution is to introduce the Rural Broadband Authority, which would consolidate the 40 different programs across 14 agencies into one program that would then inject direct federal dollars into local municipalities to build out broadband as a utility and make sure people have high quality and affordable and consistent access.
Qasim Rashid, thank you so much for joining us today on Transition Virginia.
Thanks for having me, guys. A pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much, Qasim. If you want to benefit from Pay to Play, now you can by joining Transition Virginia's exclusive Patreon community. Chip in as little as $3 to help us produce this podcast. Sustaining members get their questions asked on the show, which means you know the next guest before the episode comes out. So if you want us to ask your questions, or even if you just want to support the show, hop over to transitionvirginia.com and click the orange button to become a Patreon patron today.
And we're back on Transition Virginia, and it's question time. Now remember, if you want to ask a question on the podcast, head over to our website at transitionvirginia.com and hit the button that says Contribute on Patreon. We're able to produce this podcast with support from listeners like you. So please consider becoming a friend of the podcast. Now, this week, we've got questions from two former guests on the show. The first comes from friend of the podcast, David Ramadan, who has a question about a recent poll from Christopher Newport University. Now, unlike all the previous polls that had Joe Biden leading Donald Trump by double digits in Virginia, this new Christopher Newport poll has Biden ahead by only 5 points. That's almost within the margin of error. That prompted David Ramadan to ask this.
So a recent poll showed a small number between the Biden and the Trump campaign in Virginia. Who thinks Virginia is in play? And how's this going to affect down ballot?
David Ramadan tells me he does not think Virginia is in play, but he also tells me many of his friends who work in Republican politics actually believe they can win Virginia. Stephen Farnsworth, is there any chance Trump could win Virginia, and what kind of influence do you think he'll have on the rest of what's on the ballot?
On balance, I think if you're looking at the Electoral College math as a Republican, Virginia is not the best place to spend a significant amount of time and money. As you look at the Trump campaign, it's clear they are not doing that. There have been occasional opportunities for President Trump to speak in Virginia, but by and large, it's clear that the emphasis is on Ohio and Minnesota and a list of swing states that does not include Virginia. So I tend to be more or less in the same place where Delegate Ramadan is, that as Donald Trump and his campaign try to get to 270 electoral votes, it doesn't seem likely that Virginia is going to be much help.
Our next question comes from friend of the podcast, Trevor Sutherland. He wants to know what it says about Republicans that they can't seem to file their paperwork on time.
It seems like in these top districts, Virginia Republicans keep coming up with people that either don't know how to do paperwork or do it wrong or sign it fraudulently. And I'm just wondering if there's ever been a state where one party has had so many problems with candidates not knowing or doing improper paperwork.
A number of Republicans have had paperwork problems, including Scott Taylor, Nick Freitas, and Bob Good. Dr. Farnsworth, what's the deal?
Well, I really think this is an outgrowth of the inability of Republicans to use a consistent system for nomination. If I were advising the Republicans, I would say that the most effective mechanism is a primary. And if people were used to the rules that get you on the ballot in a primary, you wouldn't have all of these back and forth challenges. I think that it would go much more smoothly, this process, if it were a consistent one. But unfortunately, I think that the different factions within the Republican Party are fighting with each other over the mechanism so that they can make sure that their favorite candidates, be they social conservatives or more libertarians, are going to prevail in the nomination struggle. It's also the case that when a party is divided, as the Republicans are right now in Virginia, that there's not necessarily an effective system of infrastructure support. In a lot of states, the party leadership can be very, very effective in making sure that all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted for potential candidates, but that requires a bit higher level of agreement and cooperation than you see among the Virginia Republicans.
Thanks for listening to Transition Virginia. You can find us on the web at transitionvirginia.com and listen to us wherever pods are cast. Please send us an email at transitionvapodcast@gmail.com. We might read it on the air. And if you want your question read on the air to our guests, don't forget to sign up and be a Patreon today.